At my daughter's engagement, she stood tall and said, "We don't need you here, Mom." My chest burned, but I held my head high, refusing to let tears betray me. That very night, I quietly canceled every payment for the wedding they thought was already secured. What they didn't know was that this was only the beginning of a storm they had invited themselves. Before I continue the story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. The envelope was tucked between a grocery flyer and a utility bill, ordinary and unassuming. My name stared back at me, but it wasn't really mine. The ink carried a careless error, a misspelling that turned me into someone else entirely. Not Marjorie, not the woman who had raised a daughter through every fever and heartbreak, but a stranger, a guest with no history, no bond, no blood. I held it in my hands longer than I should have, blinking as though the letters might write themselves if I stared hard enough. For a moment, I tried to laugh it off. Typos happen, printers make mistakes, but deep inside, the quiet truth gnawed at me. This wasn't an oversight, this was a message. The envelope seemed heavier than paper had any right to be, as though it carried not an invitation, but an erasure. I pressed the card shut, placed it on the counter, and told myself I would not dwell. But it followed me through the night, resting on my bedside table, whispering a warning I tried to ignore. When the day arrived, the Charleston estate glowed beneath a winter sun, its columns proud against a sky brushed with pale blue. Guests drifted in laughter, spilling as freely as champagne. I walked up the steps with measured grace, my heels clicking against polished stone, my invitation tucked neatly in my purse. At the entry, a young staff member smiled brightly at the couple ahead of me, their names announced with warmth, their hands guided toward the grand hall. When my turn came, the smile faltered. She glanced at my invitation, stumbled over the misprinted name, and quickly recovered with a rehearsed politeness. This way she murmured, steering me not toward the golden chandeliers, but to the far side of the ballroom along a narrow corridor, where the air smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and damp plaster. My seat bore a card marked "Reserved," yet it sat beside the restroom doors close enough to hear the flush of pipes and the shuffle of footsteps. As I made my way past the glances and whispers, heat prickled beneath my collar. I lowered myself into the chair without protest. They had chosen this placement carefully, I realized, public enough to be noticed, humiliating enough to sting. From that chair, I became a spectator in my own family's story. I watched the polished guests mingle their glasses, raised in toasts, their laughter rippling across the room like music. At the front rows sat the bride's circle, faces glowing under the spotlight, names spoken with reverence by the host. Every detail placed them where honor resided. My own placement was its mirror opposite a deliberate exile marked in seating charts and floor plans. My daughter, radiant in her gown, never once looked my way. She smiled at others, embraced friends, posed for photographs, each gesture underlining the truth. My presence was tolerated, not welcomed. The realization cut sharper than the misprinted invitation had. It was not an accident, it was a decision. Around me, conversations fluttered, but none included me. The clink of glassware, the shuffle of shoes, the chorus of cheer, all sounds wrapped me in a cocoon of absence. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, swallowing the ache that pressed against my chest. As the evening carried on, silence became my shield. I whispered to myself the words I could not speak aloud. If they want me invisible, then invisible I will be. I would not confront, not tonight, not here, where their spectacle demanded perfection. Instead, I let the insult sink deep, pressing itself into memory like ink on paper. They believed they had placed me in the shadows, but shadows have a way of watching. The chatter of guests blurred into a dull hum as I traced the rim of my glass with one finger, committing every slight to an account only I could keep. I promised myself I would remember this night, not for the chandeliers or the music, but for the clarity it granted me. Their dismissal had drawn the first line of a ledger they could not erase. This night had only begun, and already it had given me a truth sharper than any blade. They no longer saw me as needed, and yet I remained. The toasts began the way Southern parties do sweet tea charm in crystal flutes. I sat with my hands folded, feeling the room pivot to a spotlight that did not include me. Celine lifted her glass smile, lacquered and camera-ready. She thanked the people who made me who I am, then turned toward Corbin, the groom's father, calling him her guide, her steady oak, the one who believed in my dreams even when I didn't. Applause rolled like warm surf. My name did not ride that tide. Cousins clinked, neighbors dabbed. The photographer leaned into the light. I kept my breathing even. A mother can hide a great deal in a measured breath. My daughter did not look for me. She angled her face toward the corner where applause accumulates. The host invited others to speak. Stories bloomed, childhood games, honor roll ribbons, coastal summers. Each memory had a narrator and a hero. I had given the years. Someone else received the credit. I thought of mornings when the sun was sleeping and I wasn't of worksheets signed of fevers walked away in dark hallways. This room didn't hold those nights. It held a new script where my lines were missing and my chair was near the restroom. I set a hand over my purse to steady it, or maybe myself. When laughter swelled again, it found no purchase in my corner. I let the sound pass through and kept still as if stillness alone could keep me from breaking. The lights softened and a screen unfolded against the far wall like a curtain on a stage. A slideshow flickered to life. Celine in a sandbox. Celine in a tutu. Celine in a jersey 2 sizes too big. Celine at prom with a bouquet too red for her shy smile. The images were curated, polished, edited, until no stray shadow remained. I searched each frame the way one searches a shoreline for a lost ring. I did not find myself. The photographs I had boxed and labeled over the years, the first bike, the crooked birthday cake, the Halloween cape sewn from an old curtain were absent. In their place stood pictures I had never seen taken by hands that never wiped a tear. At 3 a.m., the crowd sighed with nostalgia. A chorus. Names were called out. Inside jokes tripped across the carpet. Someone behind me whispered, "Her mom must be so proud," and the words floated without a landing place. I watched a version of my daughter's life that had been carefully laundered free of me. It felt less like a mistake and more like a design, a story streamlined for company, smooth to the touch, resistant to questions. A friend leaned toward another and said, "Is her mother here?" The answer offered softly was, "I'm not sure." I was 3 rows back, as present as the exit sign, and yet invisible. The final slide lingered Celine with Corbin's arm around her shoulders on a fishing dock at dawn. The room hummed with approval. The projector clicked, and the screen went white as blank as their memory of me. I stayed where I was, a quiet figure, in a quiet chair, while the room settled into a happy murmur. From this remove, I could hear the echo under the music, the way some guests puzzled over holes they could not name. "Strange that her mother isn't in any picture," an older woman said not unkindly. "Maybe she passed," someone answered with the odd mercy people offer when the truth is uncomfortable. I felt a laugh catch in my throat and let it go. There are nights when correcting the record only deepens the wound. I watched waiters move like pond skaters, gliding over tension without ever breaking the surface. A young cousin waved at me uncertainly, then glanced toward the head table and lowered her hand. Even the band seemed to take its cues from the hush around my seat, keeping the songs gentle, keeping the volume kind. I imagine I looked composed. Composure has been my uniform since widowhood. Underneath it, anger settled like a coin dropped in deep water there, weighty out of sight. I counted my breaths 1 through 10, then back again the way a person steadies herself during a storm's long preamble. The ceiling fans turned lazily, stirring nothing. The scent of gardenias made the air sweet and hard to swallow. I took a sip of water and let the glass steady my hands, softly. By the time the coffee arrived, I had finished taking inventory. Not the flowers or place cards, but the ledger, that mattered, the moments that said with velvet gloves that I was not needed, the wrong name on the envelope, the seat by the restroom, the speeches that leapt over me as if I were a crack in the sidewalk, the slideshow stitched without my thread. A mother can live with a bruise. She does not live well with erasure. I did not stand up or make a scene. I did not ask for the microphone. I folded the pain like a letter and put it in my purse. In the glass of the doors, I saw my reflection, and that was enough. I told the part of me that wanted to cry that tears were a private currency and would not be spent here. Instead, I made a vow so small it fit between heartbeats I would not forget. If they wished for an evening untroubled by the woman who bore the bride, they would have it. But I would keep the account. I would remember who spoke, who looked away, who smiled as if kindness were a luxury reserved for guests with better seats. That night, as the last toast fizzed and fell flat on my tongue, I knew I wasn't only overlooked, I was being written out, and the more they tried to erase me, the more certain I became that memory mine would be the pen I chose to hold. Now. The room swelled with congratulations, the way a tide crawls up a shore inch by inch until you realize your shoes are wet. I sat at my small island of linen and glassware, smiling when a gaze briefly found me, letting it fade when it slipped away. Across the current, Celine watched me with a measuring look I knew from childhood, like a seamstress deciding where to cut. She held her flute lightly, head-tilted whispers, folding around her like chiffon. I could not hear the words, but I could read the posture a decision had been made, and I was the last to learn it. Corbin and Isolde hovered at her shoulder satellites, bright enough to be mistaken for stars. The band slid from jazz into a pop chorus that invited clapping, and the clapping came warm, easy, effortless. I felt none of it reach me. The chandeliers glittered, pleased with their reflections in many glasses. A waiter offered me a crostini. I took it to give my hands a task and set it back down. In Charleston, we are taught to read a room the way sailors read cloud lines. Everything in me said a squall was forming off this coast. It wouldn't be loud. It would begin as a pressure you feel in your teeth. I folded my napkin, unfurled it, and breathed through the hush that lives under polite laughter, bracing for what came next. Celine crossed the floor like a cold front over water, beautiful and inevitable. Corbin kept pace on her right, Isolde on her left, smiles pressed in place like labels. When they reached me, Celine skipped the greeting. She glanced at the restroom sign, then at my hands folded over my purse. "Mom," she said, "you are not needed here. We've managed everything without you." The sentence tugged a loose thread, and the room watched the sweater come apart. A spoon clinked, then the quiet that follows an elegant cruelty. Someone whispered, "Oh." I looked at Celine, my girl, with the stubborn crown of hair I used to tame on school mornings, wearing a different crown now. Corbin's face said this was overdue. Isolde's said it was necessary. My blood stepped back to think. "We've got it." Celine added, softening nothing. "Pictures, vendors, speeches, it's covered. You can relax." The last two words were lace on a dismissal. I opened my mouth and closed it. People say silence is consent. Sometimes it is a refusal to feed a wound air. Aunt Ruth's bracelet chimed. The band faltered, then thinned. The coordinator's eyes slid from my badge of proximity, the restroom door, to Celine's curated center. A forced laugh bobbed up and died under the chandeliers. Celine waited the way a hostess waits for a late guest to leave. My voice surprised me. "I hear you," I said, "and I hear myself." That was all I could give without shattering us both. She nodded once as if I had agreed. The photographer lifted his camera. "Family shot." I stepped aside. The flash caught them clean and left me in the negative. I stood still the way you stand when a doctor lists possibilities. People reassembled their expressions. A few tried on pity. It fit. Others nodded as if Selena had said something sensible about logistics instead of motherhood. I caught the pastor's wife lowering her eyes as if to pray. Malis drifted close enough to be heard and not accused. "It's true," she said brightly to no one in particular. "Selene has everything under control." The sentence arrived like a pin in a thin balloon. Across the ballroom, the screen cycled through photos. Beach's birthday's the dog I bought for Selene at 9, except here it seemed to belong to everyone and no one. My chair wobbled on the carpet's edge. I steadied it, then myself. A young cousin lifted his phone for a video, lowered it again, embarrassed by the intimacy of recording a small humiliation. Another cousin squeezed my shoulder and slipped back into the safer current. I could have listed checks, deposits, the fittings I attended like a quiet soldier. I could have itemized hours spent comparing calligraphy until my eyes ached. But an audit is not love, and love is not an invoice, and none of it would change the fact that my daughter had practiced this line. She had waited for the audience. She had chosen her stage. I breathed small. I did not leave. I let the moment pass over me like a wave I refused to swallow. In silence, I counted what I would not say. Balances carried the florist's rush fee, the deposit on the chapel she adored. I remembered pinning hems while she scrolled inspiration, bringing soup in spring. If I named those things, they could be priced and argued. I would not bargain for my place with receipts. I pressed my palm to the cloth and felt the weave bite back. Across the room, Isolde poured champagne with the flourish of ownership. Corbin clapped Selene on the shoulder like a colleague. I saw my future if I allowed it, holidays arranged around my usefulness screened calls. The slow fade of a mother turned into a cautionary tale. She did not want me quiet for the evening. She wanted me off the map. So I let silence rise like a wall. I would not give them a scene to feed on. I would give them a question: what happens when the woman you push from the frame is the one holding it up? I smoothed my dress, gathered my things, and marked each slight like a stake. Her words didn't just wound me, they planted the seed of something stronger. By the time I stepped into the cooler night salt in the air and the moon snagged in the fronds, I knew I had to prepare for a battle no mother expects to fight. The applause from the toasts still hung in the ballroom like perfume when I slipped into the service corridor. The hallway was narrow, lined with stacks of folded chairs and silver trays polished to a mirror shine. Music thudded faintly through the doors behind me, an upbeat rhythm that felt wrong against the tight knot in my chest. A pair of servers passed, balancing champagne flutes, murmuring about schedules. I pressed my back against the cool wall, hoping for just a minute to breathe. Then Selene appeared. She came toward me with the composure of someone arriving for a portrait, smile set, posture flawless. Her heels clicked sharp against the tile, each step timed. "Mom," she said brightly, but there was no warmth. "Everything looks perfect tonight. We can't afford any distractions." The implication landed without explanation. My very presence was the threat she wanted to control. I steadied my hands at my sides. Anxiety crawled across my ribs, but I braced myself. If she had sought me out here away from the crowd, it wasn't to thank me. It was to cut. The smile dissolved the moment we were alone. Selene's voice lost its honey. "You make things messy," she said flatly. "I don't need you here tonight." The words were sharper stripped of their public veil, each syllable like glass underfoot. She didn't stop. "You always find a way to center yourself." Real parents, she tilted her head toward the ballroom, where Corbin and Isolde basked, keep things elegant, seamless, not awkward. She spoke as if rehearsing grievances lined up like pearls, except each pearl was false. Invented complaints, manufactured slights. My throat wanted to argue to remind her who had paid for florists and catered menus, who had steadied her when grief made her brittle. Instead, I held her gaze. I let silence answer what words would only waste. A tray clinked as a server passed the small sound, enormous in the pause. My daughter's eyes flickered but didn't soften. It wasn't a conversation, it was a verdict delivered in whispers. I swallowed the sting and let it smolder, choosing not to plead. I had begged enough in life. This time, my dignity was all I had left to hold. Let's not do this here. Isolde's voice slid into the hallway like syrup. She stepped forward, her smile tender, her tone gentle enough to fool anyone who didn't listen too closely. We just want Celine's night to be perfect. Don't ruin it for her. She touched my forearm lightly, a pat staged for the hallway's discreet camera. To anyone glancing over it would look like comfort, not interference. But the words ruin perfect were chosen with surgical care, framing me as the disturbance, her as the peacemaker. We all want the best memories, she added, voice lowered like a confidante's. I clocked every inflection, every angle of her body, sliding between me and Celine, blocking me as if I were an intruder. This was gaslighting delivered with a practiced hand, sweet-faced poison that left no mark visible to others. My humiliation tightened, then steadied. I memorized each phrase, each motion, cataloging evidence. Isolde smiled as though she had diffused something, and in that smile I saw the cage they intended to place me in. I nodded once the way a woman nods to avoid feeding gossip, but inside I built a wall of stone. As if on cue, a relative from Corbin's side rounded the corner, cheeks pink with champagne. Celine is lucky, she chirped. This family really elevates her. The words were offered as flattery, but they cut deeper than she could imagine. I managed a civil nod, the polite smile Southerners wear when they've been insulted in lace. Inside, though, I opened a ledger. I wrote her name in it alongside each word Celine and Isolde had spoken. A record of erasures, a list of who chose what role. I smoothed my dress and re-entered the ballroom. The chandeliers sparkled, the music swelled, and I returned to my corner seat without fuss. To anyone watching, I looked compliant, subdued, perhaps chastened. But beneath the calm, I made a decision I would not forget. They wanted me invisible. Instead, they taught me exactly where to stand to be seen. By the time I reached the ballroom doors, I knew the next thing they tried to take would be something I once promised to protect. The music trailed me down the side hallway as I left the ballroom, early heels quiet on old tile. I told the attendant I needed air and followed the exit sign past a clutter of folded easels toward a door marked catering. From inside, voices carried clearly the vowels bright with celebration. I knew those voices. My hand hovered over the knob without touching it. "Budget's fine," Corbin said breezy. "We just need the last confirmations." Celine answered light as glass. "Mom already covered that. You just sign and we're done." A printer word. Paper slid into a tray. I felt the floor tilt, covered that as if the money had fallen like magnolia leaves from the tree out back, not from the account I've been tending since her father died. Corbin chuckled about deposits and upgrades. "Make sure the vendor uses the rush linen," he said. "She likes the embossed menus." "She'll pay it," Celine replied, and the casual certainty cut deeper than any insult she'd offered me to my face. She wasn't bragging. She was stating weather. I stepped away before the door could open and catch me listening. Outside, the evening air tasted of river and smoke. I stood under the oaks until the music softened and the ache in my chest found a pace I could keep. At home, the house met me with honest quiet. I set my purse on the table, turned on the lamp, and opened my laptop. The ritual steadied me. Email bank folder of wedding notes. I had promised myself I would not tally love like an auditor. This was different. This was stewardship. The bank site took its time, a blue wheel turning like a dock fan. Then the numbers settled. Payments I hadn't initiated sat in a neat ladder venue, adjustment floral expansion lighting package. I clicked a vendor portal and saw my name typed in cheerful fonts I never use. In the inbox, confirmations beamed as if they were notes from friends. "We're thrilled to finalize, thank you, Marjorie." The florist's message included a photo of white peonies I had not ordered. The coordinator thanked me for approving the lighting map Isolde loved. I sat back and let the chair hold the weight I would not share. When had Celine gained access? Months ago, I'd shown her how to pay a utility bill after a storm outage. Later, I left a sealed list of passwords for emergencies. Now I traced the chain, a vendor account created from my email, then forwarded invoices, then automatic drafts. Twice the signature block showed my initials curled and precise, only they weren't mine. The G in my middle name always leans. Here it stood perfectly upright, copied from an old card. I printed the agreement and laid it beside a real signature. The forgery looked correct until you looked long. That is how people steal, by counting on a glance. On the mantel, a frame held a photograph of my grandmother, wearing the pearls on a June Sunday chin, lifted hat cocked like a small sail. I had given those pearls to Celine 3 days ago, clasping them around her neck, while she admired herself in my hallway mirror. "It makes me feel closer to you," she'd said, eyes bright. I'd swallowed a knot and kissed her temple. Tonight, under the lamp's accurate light, the scene replayed with new clarity. She had waited until the planner stopped by, then asked me to tell the story of our women wearing them, promising to keep them safe until the wedding day. It had felt like a bridge. Now I could see the footings were mine alone. She wore them at the engagement party, tilting her chin just enough for the photographer to catch their sheen. When the coordinator praised such a generous heirloom, Celine thanked her without naming the hands that fastened the clasp. That small omission told me more than any speech. She was building a life where I existed only as supply. I did not call. I did not text. The night had already told me who they wished me to be, a background checkbook and a quiet ghost. I let the kettle heat and cool without tea for the whistle, and the reminder that not everything in this house answered to someone else's timing. Then I made copies, contracts, emails, the forged initials, the list of charges. I placed them in a manila sleeve with the steadiness of someone setting seeds in rows. Steadiness is its own kind of anger, the kind that grows. I wrote dates in the margins, attached screenshots, and drafted a simple timeline. In the morning, I would call the bank, the venue, the florist. I would ask careful questions and listen to what the pauses revealed. If Celine and Corbin believed I was powerless, they had misread the woman who raised a household, buried a husband, and kept a roof intact through storms, literal and otherwise. They thought I wouldn't notice. But I was already building the file that could pull the pretty paper from their plans and leave the nails showing. By the next morning, I wouldn't be a sidelined mother. I would be an investigator in my own house, and I would know exactly where every dollar and every pearl had gone. Before shutting the laptop, I photographed the velvet box. The pearls came in the appraisal tucked beneath the tray, and locked the box inside the cedar chest by my bed now. I checked the homeowner's policy and made a note to update the rider, slipping the key onto a chain I wear during hurricane season. I typed a letter to Celine. I did not send fax boundaries. No heat. Instead, I emailed myself a list call, fraud freeze transfers request, vendor copies. Tomorrow, I would tend the truth. Sunday light fell through the tall windows of Corbin and Isolde's home, filtering across polished wood and the clink of silverware. Brunch was their showpiece eggs. Benedict with hollandaise poured tableside fruit towers arranged like centerpieces in a hotel. I sat at the far end of the table next to a sideboard stacked with coffee cups where the servants slipped in and out carrying fresh trays. Conversation swirled around me, easy and familiar for everyone else. Celine leaned forward, laughing with Isolde, eyes bright as if I weren't there. When talk turned to the wedding menu, she said Isolde's taste has been such a guide. It's made all the difference. No one glanced toward me. Corbin, in his smooth way, lifted a glass and added, "Well, weddings are for the young, aren't they? Best to let them run with it." Laughter rippled across the table, warm and unanimous, while my hands rested on the linen napkin in my lap. I felt the color climb my throat. They had folded me out of the script without ever raising their voices. For a breath, I wondered if I had imagined my place in all of this, if the woman who carried Celine, buried her father, and built her future had only dreamed her role. Gaslighting doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers until you start to doubt your own name. I sipped the bitter coffee and kept my expression still. Every instinct urged me to rise, to correct, to remind. But I let the words pass like a draft under the door. In that moment, I remembered the power of silence. People mistake it for surrender, but silence is a choice. It can be a wall or it can be a mirror. I let their laughter echo, nodding politely, folding myself into the background while my mind moved elsewhere. If they wanted to believe I was irrelevant, let them. In the pause between their jokes, I rehearsed my own strategy: observe, record, and wait. A polite smile became my armor. My fork tapped against porcelain, measured and quiet like a metronome, marking the pace of a different performance mine. Beneath the calm, bitterness pooled, but it didn't drown me. It fueled me. Each omission, each little barb went into a mental ledger. I wouldn't confront them over croissants and mimosas. I would wait until the stage was mine. That evening at home, I spread papers across the dining table, the same one where Celine once did homework under my lamp. Now it bore invoices, statements, copies I had begun gathering since the engagement. I slipped contracts into plastic sleeves, printed every email with forged initials, and arranged them by date. A manila folder bore the label I wrote in neat block letters: for Celine. Each page stiffened my resolve, turning pain into evidence. I noted times names, even the smallest discrepancies. Bank transfers linked to her account, vendor confirmations, sent at hours I was never awake. I stacked them by category: venue, florist, catering, jewelry. The pile grew into a record no laugh could erase. The printer hummed steady as my breath. This was my silent strategy in action, every document a stone laid for a path they didn't know I was building. For the first time in weeks, I felt control settle back into my hands. When the folder closed, I reached for the cedar box on the shelf. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. They were Harlan's words, saved from his years of traveling contracts. My fingers chose one without looking. His handwriting slanted familiar and steady. Protect Celine as if she were your whole heart, but never let anyone strip you of your dignity. The ache returned, but it was softened by his voice crossing years. He had trusted me to carry love and strength in equal measure. Tonight that letter became more than a memory, it was my anchor. I pressed it flat on the table beside the evidence, as if his hand still rested there. I whispered aloud, though no one could hear, "I'm not alone in this." The room felt warmer, steadier, less like a house of one. I slipped the letter back into its ribbon and placed it atop the folder. Let them think I was a ghost in the room. Ghosts can haunt in ways the living never can. And the more they dismissed me, the more determined I became to show them exactly who they were dealing with. When I think back to that night, it wasn't the speeches or the music that stayed with me the most. It was the chair. That chair by the restroom corridor where people brushed past as if I were part of the staff, where each hurried glance made me smaller. After my private confrontation in the hallway, I re-entered the ballroom, and the seat was still waiting. Unmoved, a quiet declaration of where I belonged in their design. Guests swept by with perfume and laughter, some balancing glasses of champagne, others excusing themselves to the restroom. Every brush of fabric against my arm reinforced that I was set apart, visible only when inconvenient. I folded my hands in my lap and kept my gaze forward, forcing my posture to stay tall as though I were still the woman who had once stood at the center of this family's life. But inside, humiliation pressed down heavier with each passing minute. The clinking of glasses drew everyone's attention toward the front. A second round of toasts was beginning, the kind that wrapped up the night with flair. Celine stood poised, her dress shimmering beneath the chandeliers, flanked by Corbin and Isolde, like they were her pillars. Her words carried through the microphone graceful and rehearsed praise for Corbin's steady guidance, for Isolde's warmth, for the groom's family, who made this night possible. The room erupted with applause, a cascade of appreciation that felt like a wall between me and the rest of them. Not once did she turn her eyes to me. Not once did she acknowledge the years of sacrifice that helped her reach this moment. The sting was sharp, searing through my chest. I sat frozen, smiling faintly for show, though the applause sounded more like the pounding of a door locking shut behind me. Then came the photographer's call. Family photos, please chairs, scraped glasses clinked, laughter spilled as everyone arranged themselves at the front. I rose carefully, adjusting my jacket, prepared to step forward. The photographer glanced at Celine for guidance. Celine, still smiling brightly for the camera, tilted her head just enough, a subtle shake that said no. "Just wait aside," the assistant murmured to me, pointing to the edge of the room. I obeyed, though each step back felt like slipping into shadow. Celine posed in the center, Corbin and Isolde by her side, relatives clustering around them as though I had never existed. A few guests exchanged puzzled looks, one even whispering, "Isn't that her mother?" But the flash went off, sealing the moment. I stood still, my hands clasped together, feeling the betrayal settle into my bones. When the session ended, I returned to my chair by the restroom. From there, I could see the joy, the laughter, the polished faces turning toward the camera while I sat apart, invisible by design. A couple of sympathetic guests stole glances at me, whispers passing between them like drafts of air. I met their eyes briefly, then looked away, unwilling to be pitied. Silence became my armor again. Every toast, every flash of the camera, every polite smile that cut me out only sharpened the record I was keeping inside. This was no longer mere oversight. It was orchestrated, a script written to erase me. And as I sat in that corridor chair, I knew I would carry every slight with me, not as wounds, but as evidence. The pearls looked almost foreign on her neck. I stood in the corner of Celine's townhouse, the faint scent of fabric steamers in the air as a seamstress pinned the hem of her dress. Celine turned toward the mirror, tilting her chin with practiced elegance. My mother's heirloom necklace, the one my husband once clasped around my throat on our 25th anniversary, now gleamed proudly against Celine's collarbone. She had pressed me only days earlier, voice soft but edged with demand. "It would mean the world if you passed it down now, Mother. A symbol for the future." I had surrendered, believing the gesture might bridge the widening chasm between us. Yet now, as guests filtered in to peek at her fitting, I heard the murmurs. Oh, what a thoughtful touch from Corbin's family, such refinement. Not one word about me. My legacy had been rebranded, stripped of origin, paraded as another jewel from their side. I forced a small smile when eyes turned toward me, but inside grief gnawed. Those pearls were not just decoration. They carried decades of memory, the weight of love and endurance. To see them claimed by another's narrative, their narrative felt like burial. I folded my hands tighter, nails pressing into skin, reminding myself appearances were everything tonight. I would give them silence, the kind that hides fury beneath civility. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an email from a floral vendor. The message, polite but casual, asked for confirmation on outstanding balances. Confused, I opened my laptop, scrolling through the documents. My breath caught. There were contracts, dozens of them, each with my name, my address, even my initials scribbled in shaky imitation. My accounts, drained in quiet increments, had covered deposits for catering linens, even the lighting company. The forged signatures mocked me from the screen. Celine somehow had maneuvered her way into finances I thought secured. Corbin's voice from that overheard exchange at the party returned in my head. Your mother already covered that. Covered. Stolen. Rewritten. My hands trembled, but I clicked print on every file. Page after page slid into the tray, a paper trail of betrayal. I tucked them into a folder and pressed it shut. My name had been misused, my money siphoned. But instead of panic, indignation bloomed into something colder. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought a mother's silence was ignorance. At a luncheon later that week, the humiliation surfaced again, this time draped in laughter. Celine, radiant in her pearl necklace, leaned into her circle of friends. Mom doesn't need to worry about money, she quipped, tilting her glass. She just writes checks. The table erupted, forks clinking, a chorus of amusement at my expense. Their eyes slid to me, some playful, others pitying. I managed a faint chuckle, the kind that covers pain with grace, though inside my dignity bled. I had been reduced to a faceless wallet, the living sponsor of my own erasure. I excused myself soon after retreating to the ladies' room, where the air smelled of lavender soap. I stared at my reflection pearls absent from my throat lines, etched deeper at the corners of my mouth. The silence pressed heavy, but it steadied me. That night, I laid the velvet necklace box on my desk beside the stack of debt records. Together, they painted the portrait clearly. Selena was not simply overlooking me. She was systematically rewriting me out, using my own history and my own funds as scaffolding for her future. The sting of betrayal burned, but beneath it, something sharper crystallized. I whispered to the empty room, "If they want to write me out, I'll be the author of the ending." I gathered the papers into a neat pile, slid them into the folder marked "For Selene," and closed the lid of the box with finality. Each insult, each theft, each laugh at my expense, another page in the record I would one day present not in anger, but in undeniable truth. They believed they had stripped me of power. In reality, they had handed me the tools. Every debt they buried under my name became another weapon I would use to set myself free. I woke up that morning with the Charleston sunlight spilling through the blinds, the kind of warmth that usually comforted me. But today, it felt like a spotlight pushing me to move. On the kitchen table, I spread out every invoice, every email printout, every note I had collected. My For Selene file was no longer just a folder. It was my lifeline. Page by page, I matched deposits and withdrawals, highlighting charges that had quietly drained from my account. The numbers didn't lie, and they steadied me. For once, I wasn't drowning in emotions. I was holding the map of the battlefield. I called the bank, confirmed new alerts, and requested that no more drafts could be processed without my direct word. The woman on the line sounded surprised but accommodating. When I hung up, my hands stopped trembling. Numbers didn't humiliate. They clarified. By mid-morning, I had my phone in hand and began the vendor circuit. One by one, I called them Venue Florist Caterer Photographer Band. My voice never cracked. I told each of them the same thing: any future payments would no longer come from me. They would need to contact the bride and groom's family for balances, and every new charge required my explicit authorization to move forward. Some paused, confused. One florist said softly, "Oh, I thought the groom's family had taken over." I noted her tone, calm as stone. By the time I reached the last call, my voice had taken on a steady rhythm. I wasn't pleading. I was instructing. For months, they had used my name as if it were a blank check. That ended today, but while I was locking my doors outside, they were opening theirs. A neighbor mentioned almost offhand that Corbin and Isolde had been bragging about paying for the entire event, telling anyone who'd listen that Selene's wedding was their proud gift. At church the next day, a friend leaned close and said, "Isn't it generous of them?" My smile was polite, but inside I was boiling. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. Instead, I asked the vendors to send me updated statements, paid amounts, marked with my name-dated receipts, all in order. When I slid them into my file, I felt the shift inside me. Gossip was air. Paper was stone. And my stone was growing heavier by the day. By afternoon, the pressure turned personal. A message buzzed on my phone. Melis Never Subtle asked if the family drama was true, if I was fighting Selene about the wedding. I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back, "Everything is going as planned. Thank you for your concern." That was all. No fuel for their fire. Then I set calendar reminders, payment checkpoints, a meeting with the venue coordinator, final confirmations. Each entry was a promise to myself they would not blindside me again. As I closed the laptop and slid the folder back into the drawer, I whispered aloud, if they erase the mother, they erase the wallet too. And unlike love money, leaves a trail. The first tremor would come sooner than they expected, right from the vendors they believed were already theirs. The estate was quieter than I expected when I pulled into the lot that afternoon. A week remained before the wedding, yet the air already hummed with nerves. I arrived early, as I often did, preferring to walk into a room before the crowd thickened. The coordinator greeted me with her usual brisk professionalism. We didn't need introductions anymore. She knew my name, my role, and more importantly, whose signature was still tied to the accounts. At her desk, I confirmed what I needed to see the updated billing notes reflecting the changes I'd set in motion the week before. Vendors now awaited authorization from Celine and her new family. My name, once scattered across contracts like a watermark, was no longer theirs to use. The coordinator slid the papers back into her folder, efficient and neutral. I thanked her voice, calm, my hands steady. I wasn't here to fight. I was here to watch. The rehearsal began in the ballroom, lights streaming through tall windows, polished floors echoing every step. Celine stood at the center, flawless in posture, Isolde at her side, Corbin's voice carrying instructions, as if he owned the stage. Guests trickled in laughter, filling the corners. I stayed near the edge, my seat once again tucked away, but my eyes sharper than ever. Then the phones started buzzing. The florist called first, then the caterer, then the band, each asking the coordinator for final payment authorization. Every call repeated the same line: authorization had switched approval required from the bride and in-laws. Murmurs rippled through the room. Corbin's confident tone wavered. Isolde leaned in with questions. Celine's jaw tightened. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply watched as their certainty cracked. Logistics stalled. Staff shifted nervously, waiting for answers that weren't mine to give anymore. Vindication settled over me, quiet and firm. I breathed evenly, letting the silence testify louder than words ever could. It didn't take long for Celine to snap. Her voice, cold and edged, carried across the ballroom. Why would you interfere like this? Do you want to ruin everything? Eyes turned to me. Corbin's scowl joined hers, while Isolde slipped into her usual role, smoothing her tone with false sweetness. Let's not escalate things. She just struggles to let go. Their words painted me as the problem, the saboteur. I felt the sting, but I would not let it draw blood. I met their gazes, once steady and unflinching, and replied, I simply asked vendors to bill the people in charge. Nothing more. The coordinator cleared her throat, reminding them that from this point forward, authorizations must match the payer of record. It wasn't a fight. It was policy. My silence after that became my shield again. They flailed. I endured. As the rehearsal limped back into motion, a voice brushed my ear, low and sincere. Callum, the coordinator's assistant, leaned in slightly. Are you okay? Do you need a ride home after this? No performance, no audience, just quiet kindness. I shook my head with a small smile, grateful for the question itself. Sometimes an ally doesn't need to fight beside you. Sometimes it's enough that they see you. The evening wound down with thinner smiles and tighter timing. Celine's laugh had a brittle edge. Corbin's barked instructions covered unease, and Isolde's hand lingered on Celine's shoulder like glue, holding a broken vase. I gathered my things quietly, noting the times, the names, the cracks that had begun to widen. When I stepped outside, the air was cooler, the sky fading into indigo. I felt no triumph, only resolve. They thought this tremor was a fluke, an inconvenience. I knew better. It was the first break in the facade they had built, and I wasn't about to patch it for them. The next time they tried to polish the story, I was ready for the truth to walk in, wearing its own name. 3 days before the wedding, I walked into the estate with the same quiet step I'd practiced for weeks. I no longer came to blend in, but to watch, to notice what others tried to hide. The rehearsal dinner setup buzzed in the ballroom staff, arranging silverware chairs being tested for symmetry. Yet I barely noticed the clatter. The coordinator met my eyes, then gestured discreetly toward her office. Behind the door, her face carried the weariness of someone stretched too thin. I need to show you something, she said, voice low. She admitted Celine had tried to adjust contracts even after I'd pulled out pushing costs back under my name. The words didn't surprise me, not entirely, but hearing them still sent a jolt down my spine. Proof, finally. Proof that the betrayal wasn't paranoia, it was fact. I had braced myself for disappointment. Still, it pierced deeper than I expected. She slid a document across the desk, an addendum I had never signed. My name curved across the bottom in a hand that mimicked mine, but wasn't mine. I stared at it, the ink pretending to be my voice, binding me to debts I never agreed to. Celine and Corbin had been parading their independence while keeping me chained in fine print. The shock didn't freeze me this time. It sharpened me. I took out my phone, photographed the page, then folded it carefully into my folder. The silence I'd been practicing all along crystallized into something harder. They wanted me erased, yet they used my name as the scaffolding of their illusion. And now the scaffolding had cracks they couldn't hide. That evening at the rehearsal dinner, whispers floated through the room. Guests leaned close, murmuring that vendors hadn't been paid, that Celine's voice had risen sharply with the coordinator. Once these same voices pitied me, painted me as the burden. Now suspicion turned toward her. "Why is she so frantic?" one woman asked. Another man frowned. Didn't her mother already cover this? I sipped my wine, slowly the glass cool against my fingers. I didn't correct them. I didn't add to the noise. Their curiosity was a tide, and I let it move on its own. For the first time, the weight of gossip pressed on Celine, not me, and I savored the quiet balance shifting across the room. Later, I sat in my car with the forged contract resting beside vendor statements, my folder thicker than ever. The hum of the engine was the only sound. My silence was no longer about survival. It was precision timing, a weapon sharpened against the stone of betrayal. I traced my finger along the edge of the papers, thinking of my late husband's words, of dignity, of boundaries. They had mistaken my quiet for surrender. They hadn't realized silence can carry the sharpest edge. I closed the folder with a snap. At the right moment, I would cancel everything, pull the lever they had unknowingly built into my hands. And when it fell, the illusion they had built would not just crack, it would collapse. The illusion they built was already cracking my hand on the lever would bring it all down. I arrived 15 minutes early and dressed as plain as a shadow. The oaks along the drive held their green like a blessing I no longer asked for. The coordinator met me on the portico with a nod that said, she understood now. Inside her office, we made one quiet check. All vendors were on hold for the payer of record. No new charges authorized by me. I stepped back into the light and let the stage smiles pass like weather. I stood where the breeze could find me and steadied my breathing. I was done asking to be included. The ballroom glittered the way money tries to glitter when it wants to be love. Staff hurried, doors swung, a bridesmaid rehearsed a laugh. I stayed near the doorway, a witness in comfortable shoes. The florist's van idled, then stopped. A man with a clipboard asked for the final authorization, and when none came, his team set the crates down and crossed their arms. The caterer called from the dock for immediate payment. The band wheeled cases halfway inside, then parked them like a warning. The beautiful facade waited without warmth. Celine went pale, then pink, then the polished color of someone performing calm. Corbin argued figures into the air, pointing as if the numbers might rearrange themselves. Isolde curated a smile, the kind you paste on windows, and told people it was a minor delay. Guests began to arrive and felt the wobble in the floorboards. Whispers loosened like ribbon. The coordinator touched my elbow and asked for a small huddle. I stepped to the doorway and said only, "My authorization ended 2 weeks ago." The room did not argue. We moved to the office. I set a slim folder on the desk. Copies of my withdrawals, time-stamped emails, the forged addendum with my name bent into a shape I never gave. Celine's eyes flicked over the pages and then refused to land. Corbin pressed his lips into a line so thin it almost disappeared. Isolde's smile finally showed its seams. I did not raise my voice. "You told me I wasn't needed," I said evenly. I listened. The coordinator summarized for the room as coordinators do, who had paid what and when. Through the door, a clutch of guests caught the edge of that summary and carried it like pollen. Praise thinned into questions. A neighbor's glance shifted from adoring to careful. Malus, who enjoys the scent of smoke, drifted nearer and then away when the breeze changed. Corbin reached for his wallet, then his phone, then the wall for balance. Numbers are steady things. They do not love and they do not lie. He could not conjure what was not there. I looked at the pearl necklace at my daughter's throat and held out my hand. No speech, no scene. Just an open palm from the woman who once kept the night feedings and the emergency room forms and the mortgage that sheltered us all. Celine's fingers trembled. She unclasped the heirloom and set it in my hand with a soft clink as final as a gavel. I slipped it into its velvet box and felt the weight of 4 women rest against my skin again. "I wish you well," I said, and meant it the way a surgeon means it when she puts down a scalpel. A marriage needs honesty more than flowers. Callum appeared at the portico as the evening light softened, not rescuing me, just offering an arm. I took it because kindness asks nothing, and because I had stood alone long enough. Behind us, the coordinator managed a plan that did not include me. The day would continue, or it would not. Either way, my ledger was closed. Weeks later, a simple courthouse ceremony happened without centerpieces or speeches. They paid for it themselves. A short note arrived in my mailbox in a hand I knew. I see it now. I set it beside the velvet box and wrote back a blessing, not a check. I returned the quiet to my porch and listened to the cicadas argue with the dusk. Needed or not, I had kept my dignity, and that has a way of lighting the path home. A breeze lifted the curtains and carried out the last noise. What remained was mine to keep now. On the kitchen counter, I laid the file flat and slipped the copied contract into a plastic sleeve. It was not a trophy. It was simply the proof I would keep, should anyone try to rewrite the night. I brewed tea in the old blue pot and read my husband's letter again, the one that told me to protect the children, but never surrender my name. I was late to that lesson, but not too late. In the morning, I would take the quilt to the shelter and sign up to teach stories at the library. Boundaries are a kind of love for the self. I touched the pearls once more before putting them away. They were cool, like river stones. I thought of the years that taught me to let silence do its work, of the bills that taught me to sign for myself, and no one else of the moment a mother learns that love and rescue are not the same. The moon lifted over Charleston, steady and unconcerned. Somewhere music started up a band that had been paid by someone who had learned how that works. I smiled small and real, the kind you keep for yourself. I did not need the last word. The paper had spoken. The accounts had spoken. The open palm had spoken. I locked the box, turned off the porch light, and left the night to hold what it would. Tomorrow would be ordinary again, a grocery list, a walk by the water, perhaps a call I would choose to answer. Tonight belonged to quiet, to a woman who finally stood where she could be seen by the only witness that mattered, herself. Looking back on everything I went through, I realized the most important truth. Dignity is something no one can take from you unless you hand it over. I learned that silence is not weakness. It can be a shield, and sometimes the strongest voice is the one that speaks only when it matters most. My story is not just about betrayal or loss. It's about choosing respect for yourself, even when others try to erase you. So I ask you, what would you have done in my place? Do you believe family loyalty has limits, or do you think love should always mean sacrifice? No matter the cost, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments or share where you're watching from. And if it didn't tell me why, I value your honesty. Don't forget, if you want to follow more stories like this, please hit subscribe and stay with me for the next journey.